Hello, I'm Sam Lloyd, priest in charge of Trinity Church, Boston. Welcome to a year of the Bible. The following presentation is part of an adventure our parish is taking together to explore the Hebrew Scriptures, the foundational stories of our faith, and to wrestle with the great mysteries of God, life, love, and justice. We're delighted to have you join us. Let us pray. Come, O Holy I Am, into our midst. Speak to us in the words that have been uttered in the past. Speak to us now in our hearts and minds and spirits. We ask in your name. Amen. We are looking today at the epicenter, probably we might even say almost the genesis and the epicenter of the whole Hebrew Scriptures, and the epicenter of the faith of the people of Israel, the heart of the faith of our Jewish brothers and sisters, and the absolute foundation of everything that unfolds in our Scriptures. It's that important. I didn't know that. When I went to seminary, I thought, you start at the beginning, and the most important thing was creation, and we follow the stories along. If you take a Hebrew Scriptures course these days, I think this has probably been true for at least a generation, you never start with creation, you start here. You start with the great event in their history, the Exodus. That shaped everything, and they lived through that, and then looking back, they created the creation, or actually found some of the narratives and began to weave it together. I took the luxury of putting our timeline back in front of you today. If we could project things, we wouldn't be doing all this with paper, but we just haven't got that capacity yet. I wanted you to see where we are. We were doing, the market was very high at the beginning. The creation was terrific. The prospects were good. But there was a very quick crash. And then beginning in Genesis 12, with the calling of Abraham, God has done what God does throughout the Scriptures, which is choose one person and one people for the saving of the world. God decides. God's way is, some of the language is the scandal of particularity, to take one person, one people, and draw them into living out the life they're meant to live on behalf of the saving of the world. That's, to put it in contemporary language, God knew to start small and scale up. That's where he wants to go with this. So we follow the patriarch story of Jacob, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And now they're in Egypt. Their fortunes have plummeted. And what began as a place to find food and sustenance, and they were a resourceful people and began to become prosperous, Pharaoh became threatened. And out of that came, we aren't sure of the timelines for all this, but Pharaoh became oppressive. Eventually they became slaves, and eventually they were in desperate straits, and that's the moment when Moses was called. And so we're launching now this upward swing, a bull market, you might say, and we will be following the course of the people of Israel as God is working with them to shape the possibility for the redemption of the world. That's why, and so it's a long trajectory, heading out from slavery, going through the Red Sea, wandering for 40 years in the Promised Land, being given. This is critical, being given the law. The huge gift God gave the people of Israel was the 10 words, what we call the 10 Commandments. Was seen as maybe the most precious gift God could give the human race, because finally they knew the shape their lives were meant to live. And on they go, becoming more and more a conscious people, the Hebrews, the people of Israel, gaining more strength, the tribes coming together until ultimately the first kingdom arrives in David. So that's That's the trajectory that we're on now. They are now at a desperately low point, but in what we're hearing about today, in God's acting in Moses, the story says, the whole thing begins to turn around. So that's the broad shape. People get closer now to being able to pinpoint timelines. They're not absolutely certain when the Exodus happened, but it's getting closer to a realistic timeline. They are confident that there was an Exodus. The patriarchal stories we've been through is much fuzzier. They are confident that there in fact was an Exodus. They seem to be fairly confident there was a slavery, there was an oppression, and there was a flight from Egypt headed to the Promised Land. There is no certainty that the seas parted. Cecil B. DeMille wasn't available at the time. But interestingly, even in the story itself, there are two versions of the escape itself. One less dramatic than the other. One using more natural explanation, and one the high drama itself. But at the heart of it, we know, was this experience of liberation because it utterly shaped a people. Before this, the Hebrews were a set of tribes, all related. The whole story of Joseph as one of the 12 was there were 12 tribes. At some point, they began to coalesce. In Egypt, it's believed, under slavery and the escape, they became a people for the first time. Those 12 tribes saw themselves as one people, now called by God to be the agents for the saving of the whole world through what God intended to do with them. So that's the big picture. A couple of things about these 15 chapters. There seem to be almost a script for a pageant. In larger outline, that the first 15 chapters are of a piece, and they're telling the most sacred narrative for the Jewish people of all. So there are some beautiful passages, some inspiring celebration, some moments of bravery and declaration. It would be, something like taking 1776 and the events just before and after that, and writing a script that would become Holy Writ. Their holiest moment has now been committed to print. And inside those 15 chapters, we get a lot of very significant material. For example, 4 chapters of it are basically giving the ritual for Passover. Passover is the Jewish expression of what God has done for them. When I get to the end, I'd like to say something about Passover and Eucharist. But the whole 15 chapters are, and this goes deep in the psyche of the Hebrew people, aren't meant to be history remembered, but our story told in such a way that we relive the story. This is not a history from way back. This is our story. This is who we are. We are a people who lived through that once and who find that still to be our story today. The fancy word for this is anamnesis, A-N-A-M-N-E-S-I-S, which is to say not to remember for the sake of the past. Anamnesis is remembering for the sake of entering into again. Our Eucharist is an act of anamnesis, an act of remembering for the sake of entering in. What we believe happens in the experience of Eucharist is in some profound way, we're there again at the Last Supper, and Jesus is feeding us. That in some strange way, because those events have their place in eternity beyond the limits of time, when we recall those, are able to be called back into them again and find ourselves contemporaries with the Christ who feeds us, and in this case with the Moses who set people free. One last comment. If you're reading through this, there are lots of times when things are told more than once. here we are, and I know Bill has mentioned this before, here we are seeing at least three different documents being woven into this story. And those documents themselves were the weaving of stories. The J document is the biggest, the grandest, we call it the Yahwist document. But when you see it's told a couple of times, people didn't want to turn loose of some of these stories. They wanted to keep them in the story, so there can be some non sequiturs when something is happening more than once. Okay. What I'd like to do is maybe just name some of the sections and linger over a few as we go along. The story begins basically with explaining why the people of Israel were oppressed, why they were in Egypt, what happened to them. They were up in the Palestine area, now they're in Egypt, and for a while they prospered, but soon after that they found themselves becoming increasingly oppressed. We get early on the story of the birth of Moses, almost certainly a legend. If you're going to have a great hero, you're going to have an amazing story of how things happened at the beginning. But it's an important story of, in this case, a whole set of women who become part of making the story possible by protecting this vulnerable infant, making sure he survives, and tells the story of how Moses, this Hebrew boy, becomes part of the regal court of the Pharaoh. Moses itself is an Egyptian name. Moses, the hero of the Hebrew people, became part of the whole Egyptian structure until the injustice became so bad. Moses lost his temper at one point and actually killed someone who was oppressing the Hebrews. And from that he was on the run some, and the rest of the events were converging to bring things to a crisis. So the first phase is the birth of Moses. It's a way of locating Moses himself among his people with this extraordinary sort of moment of having been given this standing in the court of Egypt before things began to unravel. After Moses' murder, he goes after Moses kills the man, he takes off into the desert, hides for a while, and then comes back, and we're getting a picture of increasing injustice. The Pharaoh, at one point, calling for the murder of all the Hebrew boys. Moses' own sense of rage and injustice is rising. He goes out into the desert, spends some time, then comes back, then goes out again, and that's where the call experience happens. The sermon talked a fair amount about the call experience. It's seen as one of the irreplaceable events in the history of religion itself. There's a fancy term Rudolf Otto talks about for that I am experience, an experience of the numinous, or more particularly the mysterium tremendum et fascinans. How's that? Otto says at the core of every religion is this experience of something that is wholly other, mysterium, beyond, tremendum, which is overwhelming, terrifying, frightening, hugely shaking, and at fascinans, something that also attracts and makes you want to claim it for yourself. This, at the heart of Buddha, at the Bo tree, at the heart of Muhammad's experience, at the heart of Christianity, at the heart of Judaism is or are experiences of the mysterium tremendum et fascinans. This being claimed and grasped by a moment of experience that comes before you. At some point I want to talk about this notion of being grasped as, I think, a way to understand how God speaks in the world. So the encounter happens. Moses resists. Moses says, "You got the wrong guy." Tries to get out of it. God stays with it. God promises to go with him along the way. And Moses ultimately agrees to set out. And then in Exodus chapter 3, you get basically the whole program for what God lays before him. And for those who are on top of all this, let me just read this passage. Exodus 3, beginning at verse 16, God says, "Go and assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I have given heed to you and to what has been done to you in Egypt. I declare that I will bring you up out of misery to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, to a land flowing with milk and honey. They will listen to your voice, and you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us now go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness, so that they may sacrifice to the Lord our God. I know, however, that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my wonders that I will perform in it. After that, he will let you go. I will bring this people into such favor with the Egyptians that when you go, you will not go empty-handed." On it goes. So there's the strategy. God is going to use this one. God is going to lead them out. God is going to stretch out the hand and strike Egypt. And what's happening here is we're seeing unfold not simply a conflict between, say, Moses and Pharaoh, but a conflict between the gods. This is a contest between the Yahweh, I am God, and the Egyptian gods. And what Yahweh is saying is, I'm going to win. I've actually got the cards, and no matter what they throw at this, I'm going to lead you through it. So that gives Moses the confidence to go ahead. And so then the tension rises. There's more and more persecution, and finally Moses decides it's time to actually confront the Pharaoh. God launches a set of plagues along the way. You remember those plagues? They come in a very careful order, and there's a constant negotiation now. Pharaohs will often say, okay, I'll let you guys go. I know you want to go. They start packing up to go, and Pharaoh stops them and brings them back. And so we watch a kind of adjudication back and forth between Moses and Pharaoh, and between Yahweh and their gods. And often the tool in play is these plagues. So time and again they come. The blood pollution of the Nile, frogs, gnats, pure torture there, flies, disease, boils, thunder and hail, locusts, and then dense darkness. One after another comes. Pharaoh backs off. Pharaoh's worried. Pharaoh makes some promises, doesn't keep them, and it happens again and again. And there is a kind of ritual quality to this. It's as if you took the Revolutionary War and you did it in 5 acts, and you had some careful choreography of how it's going to happen and put some symmetry in it. This is a sort of mapping out very vividly, and in a way that could have been not so much acted out, but could have been sung or even danced with, but told again and again as Israel relived once and relives again and again the story. So high drama as the plagues come underway, and very drama means that things are getting tenser and tenser, and it's hard to know what will come next. So so then we come. That's the great conflict. Then we come to the great moment of escape. It begins in chapter 11, and here we have combined both the preparation for this escape and the telling of the story of Passover. Begins chapter 11 around verse 15. Here, even though it's told as a narrative, what's actually going on here is the creating of a liturgy for the people of Israel to remember all the things that went on. Which is not to say in any way that something like these events didn't happen. I think it did. If you want to talk about the Last Supper, I do not think at that original Last Supper, Jesus had a beautiful silver chalice and had some elegant words and some beautiful music as we get to have to go through it. What we have is a cultic enactment ourselves in the Eucharist of an historical event in the past. But what these cultic acts do is they make it possible for us to experience anamnesis, to experience going back, to experience being there for ourselves. And so the narrative begins. One key piece of this story is that it is the Passover, as it is described in here, is intended to be something primarily done in the home. Let me just read you a few verses from the beginning of chapter 12. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall mark for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the first year. Tell the whole congregation of Israel that on the 10th of this month they are to take a lamb for each family, a lamb for each household. If a household is too small for a whole lamb, it shall join." That's not sounding like history unfolding. That's sounding like pretty careful instructions for a home Eucharist, for a family getting together to remember, to tell the story. And that's precisely what it was. Interesting note here, Passover is intended to be a family remembering. Very basic to the Hebrew people was the faith they carried as they gather as a family to remember and tell the story. For whole periods of its life, when they had grand temples, they wanted to do great big services, and many in the priestly cult tried to make Passover the great event of all, but always they have remembered that it belonged in the heart of the family. The Eucharist, by the way, began in the families. The early Jews who were becoming Christians would go to a Jewish temple on Sunday for the worship and gather in homes to break the bread and share the wine. So very similar patterns of history. If you look at page 13, chapter 13, there are whole directions for explaining the meanings of this to the children. So we're way off from history here, but far into the core identity of what it means to be the people of Israel. That brings us to the great moment of deliverance in the crisis of the Red Sea. Chapter 14, I want to read you a piece of this. I'll start us in medias res a little bit. Chapter 15. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to go forward. But you lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the Israelites may go into the sea on dry ground. Then I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them. And so I will gain glory for myself over Pharaoh and all his army, his chariots and his chariot drivers. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gained glory for myself over Pharaoh and his chariots and his chariot drivers." Then it says, the angel of God who was going before the Israelite army moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from in front of them and took place behind them. It came between the army of Egypt and the army of Israel, and so the cloud was there with the darkness, and it lit up the night. Then, verse 21, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. The Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went into the sea after them, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and chariot drivers. At the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and cloud looked down upon the Egyptian army and threw the army into panic. He He clogged their chariot wheels so that they turned with difficulty. The Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the Israelites, for the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." And the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea," and on it goes. High drama. An immense story. Parenthetically, I've just learned that there's a major motion picture coming out with Russell Crowe about Noah. So we can hope that maybe soon, they're clearly following on us and what we're doing. So this could be the next one. Russell Crowe is Noah in the story, so we have some plans to get them to pick this one up next. The drama is huge, and you'll see when we read the psalm at the end, they never stopped singing about this great moment. Whatever the history is, and this is not an historical narrative, it is a theological and liturgical memory of how at some point they were set free in Egypt and given life again. And they were utterly convinced that the great I am, the great mystery that grasped Moses and turned him into a liberator, was the one who led them to safety and to a new life, and the one who ultimately took them to the promised land, and took them to Mount Sinai to receive the gift of the law, and called them to be his people, to embody everything that God hoped for the whole human race. So this is a story that sends chills up your spine, for even though unsure as we are about the details, this is a story where people were made and were utterly convinced that it was God at the center of it, holding them. If you'll turn to page 15 for a minute, I want to give you some sense of the energy and gratitude. Chapter 15, actually before I do that, I want you to jump to verse 21. Exodus, verse 21. They think this is probably the earliest scrap of ancient scripture in the whole Bible. This simple song of Miriam. Miriam, Moses' sister, we think. And Miriam sang to them, "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea." Have you found that phrase? Many people say the Bible begins there. It begins with a song of gratitude for being saved. It begins with the conviction that on their side was a power and a love that could overcome anything coming at them. It begins with this utter sort of speechless delight. And more than likely, this was something that they danced to, that sang songs to. Back in our seminary days, we had to learn to sing a song of this both in Hebrew and in English. I'll spare you what they are, but they're great. So that was the core. That's the atomic explosion at the heart of the Bible. Everything, Big Bang, everything flows from this sense of being set free by some mysterious power who's calling them to be their people. Now, catch some of the poetry of it back to the beginning of Exodus 15. And by the way, if you're in church today, the psalm today is celebrating these very same acts. I'm sure you spotted that. But the psalm that is sung today is remembering this very same thing that happened. But listen. Then Moses and the Israelites sang the song to the Lord. "I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he is thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my might, and he's become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my Father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior, the Lord is his name." We have a canticle of this that we sing sometimes. But on it goes. Let me just give you a couple of about three more of the verses. "Pharaoh's chariots and his army he cast into the sea. He picked off his picked officers were sunk in the Red Sea. The floods covered them. They went down into the depths like a stone. Your right hand, O Lord, glorious in power. Your right hand, O Lord, shattered the enemy. In the greatness of your majesty, you overthrew your adversaries. You sent out your fury. It consumed them like stubble. And at the blast of your nostrils, The waters piled up. Now that's powerful stuff. A huge celebration of the utter conviction at the center of everything, that at the heart of their life was a God who was dead set against oppression and injustice, and chose this people and its oppression as a way to begin to set a people free. And so Israel, you'll see Israel feels overwhelmed in gratitude for what's happened to them, but they also see it's an immense responsibility they carry. That because they have been set free, it is their purpose for the world to be agents of the saving of the rest of the world. And of course, just to leap forward, we know the complexities of history and the complexities of the Hebrew people and the complexities of all peoples. But we Christians came to see ourselves as the Gentile extension of the commission the Hebrews got from Yahweh. Yahweh said, go be a people yourselves. This cultic, often ethnic, but deeply tied together people, go live this way. We Christians, as we were figuring out who we were, came to be convinced that when Jesus came, he wanted us to be the Gentile branch of this very same covenant. It was going to be us carrying that commitment to be a people that wanted to be liberators ourselves out into the world. So a very small group was now expanding as we believe Jesus claimed the birthright of the Jewish faith, now making it available to everyone else. I want to close just looking at one other piece here. If you'll turn to the back of the sheet, if the Song of Miriam, this ecstasy of joy at this saving, freeing God. The ecstasy, the best I can think of is you remember those hopeful days when the Arab Spring was spreading across and you saw people dancing in the street, dreaming of their freedom, speechless, with a stunned awareness that something massively historical would take place to set them free. And of course, their history has been as complex since, as certainly the history of all peoples have been complex since. But there are moments when we sense that the power behind the universe turns toward the good. We know the great Martin Luther King quote, "The arm of the Lord bends." The arc of justice is long, but it bends toward justice. That's the utter conviction for all the complexities. Then we have this, the earliest creed. The earliest, we have our Nicene Creed, the Hebrew people developed theirs, and this became something that was endlessly sung and chanted. By the way, the part of the psalm I just read is in the daily prayer for many Jewish communities, and it's certainly read at Sabbath. Much of this prayer of what happened at the Red Sea. But here we get the full summary of how the Hebrew people trace their history. It comes in the context, Deuteronomy is filled with laws for how the Hebrew people are to live their lives. So Deuteronomy, part of the teaching, you shall make this response before the Lord your God. A wandering Aramean was my ancestor. That would be Jacob. He went down into Egypt, Jacob and Jacob's people. Or maybe it's Joseph there. He went down into Egypt and lived there as an alien, few in number. And there he became a great nation, mighty and populous. When the Egyptians treated us harshly and afflicted us by imposing hard labor on us, we cried to the Lord, the God of our ancestors. The Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. The Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with a terrifying display of power and with signs and wonders. And he brought us into the place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. That's crafted in Hebrew into a very tight, almost creedal, almost musical sounding form, something they would sing again and again. to remember who we are. We all need our creeds. We need them to remind us where we come from and who we are. And this great creed is part of that celebration. And so we have a picture of God choosing to act, a God who is a liberator. And of course, it's not to say God has never done this, but this is now happening to a people in a place and in a way that they can begin to take it on board. They've become self-aware as a people, reflective as a people, to begin to acquire a consistent narrative of what's behind everything going on. And what they realized was this did it. This was the breakthrough, working through one man leading a group of people to become ultimately the group that would lead the world to the hope that is before them. It's a great and mysterious story. There's much that we don't know. But what we know is here we have the heart of the Hebrew story, and therefore the heart of a good bit of our story. I'll stop there.